Hey there, folks. Clyde Chester here, and tonight I want to tell you about America's oldest unsolved mystery, a story about 115 English colonists who vanished without a trace from a settlement on the Carolina coast, leaving behind only a single cryptic word carved into a tree. I'm talking about the Lost Colony of Roanoke, the haunting disappearance that's captivated Americans for over 4 centuries. This is a story about ambition and desperation, about the brutal realities of colonial survival, and about how sometimes, despite all our modern knowledge and archaeological techniques, the past keeps its secrets. This is the mystery of what happened to the Roanoke colonists and why we still don't know the answer. Let me take you back to 1587, to a time when England was hungry for empire. Spain had conquered vast territories in the Americas, was shipping gold and silver back to Europe, was building an empire on which the sun never set. England wanted in on that action. Queen Elizabeth I authorized Sir Walter Raleigh to establish colonies in the New World, to plant the English flag on American soil, to compete with Spain for control of this vast, rich continent. Raleigh had already tried once. In 1585, he'd sent a military expedition to Roanoke Island, a small barrier island off the coast of what's now North Carolina. That first colony lasted less than a year before the colonists gave up and sailed back to England with Sir Francis Drake. But Raleigh wasn't done. In 1587, he organized a new expedition, and this time it wasn't going to be soldiers and adventurers, it was going to be families, men and women and children who would build a permanent settlement, who would farm and build homes and create the first English community in the New World. The expedition was led by John White, an artist and gentleman who'd been part of that earlier failed colony. White recruited 115 colonists, men, women, and 17 children. These weren't aristocrats or professional soldiers. These were middle-class English people, tradesmen and farmers, people looking for opportunity and a fresh start. Among them was White's own pregnant daughter, Eleanor, and her husband, Ananias Dare. They were going to America to build something, to create a new world for themselves and their children. They set sail in May 1587 on 3 ships. The plan was to stop briefly at Roanoke Island to check on a small garrison of 15 men that had been left there from the previous expedition, then continue north to the Chesapeake Bay area, where they'd establish their permanent settlement. The Chesapeake had better harbors, better agricultural land, more strategic location. Roanoke was supposed to be just a waypoint, a brief stop on the way to something better. But the ship's pilot, a Portuguese sailor named Simon Fernandez, had other ideas. When they reached Roanoke in late July, Fernandez refused to take the colonists any further north. He wanted to get back to privateering, attacking Spanish ships and stealing their cargo, and he wasn't interested in spending more time ferrying colonists around the coast. So he dumped them on Roanoke Island, told them this was where they'd be staying, and prepared to sail back to England. John White was furious, but what could he do? His people were already ashore, their supplies had been unloaded, and Fernandez controlled the ships. So the colonists made the best of it. They moved into the abandoned fort and buildings from the previous expedition, started repairing structures, began planting crops. It was late in the season to be starting a colony. July was already past the optimal planting time, but they had no choice. On August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. It should have been a moment of triumph and hope, a symbol of the colony's future, but the reality was grim. Supplies were low, relations with the local Native American tribes were tense at best and hostile at worst. The colonists had arrived too late in the season to plant adequate crops, which meant they'd be dependent on resupply from England to survive the coming winter. The colonists made a desperate decision. John White would sail back to England with the ships, gather more supplies and reinforcements, and return as quickly as possible, ideally before winter. John White didn't want to go. He was the governor, the leader, and he didn't want to abandon his people. More than that, he didn't want to leave his daughter and newborn granddaughter. But the colonists insisted. John White had connections in England, had Raleigh's ear, could most effectively secure the supplies and support they needed. So, in late August 1587, just 9 days after his granddaughter's birth, John White sailed for England, promising to return within a few months. He never saw any of them again. White's return voyage was delayed by circumstances beyond his control. When he reached England in November 1587, the entire country was mobilizing for war. Spain was preparing the massive naval force that would become the Spanish Armada, an invasion fleet meant to conquer England. Queen Elizabeth I ordered that all ships, all resources, all attention be focused on defending England against the Spanish threat. No ships could be spared for a relief expedition to some distant colony in America. White was frantic. He knew his people were running out of time, running out of supplies. He managed to scrape together 2 small ships in April 1588 and tried to sail for Roanoke, but the ships' crews were more interested in attacking French and Spanish vessels than in delivering supplies to colonists. The expedition turned into a privateering venture, got into a naval battle with French ships, was badly damaged, and had to limp back to England. White never made it across the Atlantic. The Armada crisis dominated 1588. By the time the Spanish threat was defeated and ships became available again, it was 1589, then 1590. White kept pushing, kept begging for a relief expedition, but Raleigh's attention was elsewhere, and White didn't have the resources to finance a voyage himself. Finally, in March 1590, almost 3 years after he'd left his colonists, White managed to secure passage on a privateering expedition that agreed to make a stop at Roanoke. They reached the Outer Banks in August 1590. White could see smoke rising from Roanoke Island, which gave him hope. Surely that meant his colonists were still there, still alive, keeping fires burning. On August 18, 1590, his granddaughter's 3rd birthday, White landed on Roanoke Island. The settlement was deserted, completely abandoned. The houses were taken down in an orderly fashion. This wasn't a panicked evacuation, but a deliberate departure. The protective palisade they'd built was still standing, overgrown with vines and weeds. Inside, White found his belongings scattered and ruined by weather and animals, his maps, his books, his armor, all left behind and destroyed by 3 years of exposure. But there were clues. Carved into a post of the palisade, White found the letters CRO, and carved into a tree near the entrance to the fort, in large capital letters, the word CROATOAN. Before White had left in 1587, he and the colonists had agreed on a plan. If they needed to abandon Roanoke, they'd leave a message indicating where they'd gone. And if they were leaving under duress, if they were being attacked or forced out, they'd carve a Maltese cross along with the message. White found no Maltese cross. The carvings appeared to be unhurried, deliberate. The colonists had left a message and departed, and they weren't in immediate danger when they did so. CROATOAN was the name of a nearby island, about 50 miles south, and also the name of a friendly Native American tribe that lived there. The colonists had maintained good relations with the CROATOAN people. One of the Native Americans who'd traveled to England with an earlier expedition, a man named Manto, was CROATOAN, and he'd returned to Roanoke with White's colony. The message seemed clear. The colonists had gone to CROATOAN Island, had relocated there, were probably living with or near Manto's people. White was desperate to sail to CROATOAN Island and find his daughter and granddaughter, to reunite with the colonists he'd left behind 3 years earlier. But once again, circumstances conspired against him. A storm was brewing. The ships had already lost several anchors in the difficult waters of the Outer Banks. The privateering captains, who'd only agreed to stop at Roanoke as a favor and were eager to get back to hunting Spanish ships, refused to make the 50-mile trip south to CROATOAN. They needed to leave immediately, before the storm hit and before they lost more equipment. White had no choice. He wasn't in command of the ships, couldn't force them to take him to CROATOAN. On August 19, 1590, the ships departed Roanoke, and White never returned. He spent the rest of his life in Ireland, never organizing another relief expedition, never finding out what happened to his colony, his daughter, his granddaughter. He died sometime around 1993, having failed in his mission to rescue the people he'd left behind. And that's where the real mystery begins, because from 1590 to today, 434 years, we've never definitively found out what happened to those 115 colonists. The most obvious theory, based on the CROATOAN carving, is that the colonists relocated to CROATOAN Island, integrated with the local Native American population, and survived. It makes logical sense. The colonists knew they couldn't survive on Roanoke. The island was too small, too exposed, too vulnerable. CROATOAN offered better resources, better protection, and friendly Native Americans who could teach them survival skills. Archaeological evidence from CROATOAN Island, which is now Hatteras Island, has turned up artifacts that might be associated with the Roanoke colonists: European pottery, metal tools, items that suggest English people lived there in the late 16th century. There are also